Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for the launch of AMDA's Benchmarking Africa's Minigrids report. My name is Aaron Leopold. I am the CEO of the Africa Minigrid Developers Association, and I am very proud to welcome you to the launch of our first flagship publication, which features fascinating new insights into the world of African minigrids. We have a very exciting webinar prepared for you today with, of course, the main findings of the report, but also insights and thoughts from some of the sector's leading minds from the investor community, from government, from a multilateral development organization, and from, of course, AMDA members themselves. I'm very, very happy right now to introduce Emily Motor, the COO of SteamaCO, which is one of AMDA's founding members and a board member of the Africa Minigrid Developers Association. Just to provide a little bit of context before we hand the presentation of the report over to Jessica Stevens, the COO of AMDA, and Daniel Kitwa, our AMDA's finance specialist. So with that, I will hand it over to Emily to say a few opening remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. Can you hear me all right? Okay,
yes.
Great. So welcome everyone to the launch of AMDA's first ever mini-grid benchmarking report. I'm Emily. I'm on AMDA's board of directors. And for those of you who don't know AMDA, we are an association of mini-grid developers and operators who recognized that in order to achieve universal energy access, we needed to join forces to coordinate and to share knowledge. AMDA was necessary because so much of what the world knows about electrification is based on outdated and unsustainable infrastructure of the past. And at AMDA, we believe that Africa is in actually the perfect position to leapfrog the old energy grid. But to do this, a great deal of work and coordination is needed across governments, financiers, and the private sector. And that is where AMDA comes in. So as I think the invitation mentioned, this report is the product of years of work. It was actually one of the first major initiatives that AMDA launched. And I want to spend just a minute highlighting how extraordinary that is. An industry association that at the time had 2 full-time staff and a group of passionate members volunteering their time, immediately set to work collecting and aggregating and processing data about their own performance for the sake of sector-wide learning. That is serious commitment, but I know that it was worth the effort. I look at the challenge of universal energy access as a challenge in decision-making. Everyone in this market is grappling with complex, high-stakes decisions. How much do you charge for power? Where do you build out first? How do you allocate your limited resources? And all of these questions require intelligent, high quality decision-making. And we're gonna, I think, hear more about that in our panel later on. We won't make the right decisions without the right data to inform those decisions. At SteamaCO, we like to say, garbage in, garbage out. We need the right inputs to the decision-making process. And AMDA really chose to prioritize data reporting so highly because its members appreciate what's at stake here. Electricity is not kilowatt hours. Electricity is health, it's education, it's economic opportunity, especially in the time of climate change. There are few things that have more profound impact on quality of life than the services that are provided by AMDA's members. And I am incredibly proud to be working alongside people who recognize that and who demonstrate through initiatives like this just how committed they are to the future of this market. So I just want to thank everyone who was involved in preparing this report, the data working group, all of the AMDA members who contributed their data, Jessica, who led everything, our partners, PowerforAll, Odyssey, and ECA, without further ado, let's get to business.
Thanks, Emily. Jessica, why don't you take the reins?
Sorry, thanks everyone. Just give me a second to share my screen. Hi, everyone. As Emily and Aaron said, my name is Jessica Stevens. I'm the COO of AMDA, and I've spent the last year and a half of my life working on this report. And before we just jump into the to the analysis and inputs of the data, I also just want to thank ECA, who's been our partner in creating the report and has dedicated a tremendous amount of time to the analytics and writing the report and putting together the information that makes this possible, and to all of our developers who provided data. It's been amazing to work with so many people who are so dedicated to creating transparency in the sector. So very briefly, Emily alluded to this in her comments, but this has been a almost 2-year process to get to the point of publication. It's involved data inputs from all of our members, and the indicators that we go over in this report were all co-designed with the AMDA membership, as well as a large group of stakeholders in the sector who have been working on data and research. And ECA has been working independently since early this year to clean and analyze the data for us as an independent third party. So the data in this report is representative of private sector mini-grids across the African continent. It's representative of operational mini-grids in 12 different countries. And there are limitations within the scope of this report. While we do collect national level data, this report is really organized around either Pan-African results or Eastern and Western African results. And this is to ensure the anonymity of the developers themselves, so that no single piece of data can be traced back to an individual developer. The scope of the indicators in here and the data that we collected falls across 3 major areas. One is project level data. We collected cost and operational data, sales, revenues, and consumption data from all of our developers across the continent. And then we collected some organizational data. Most of these indicators are around jobs, growth, and sort of macro level information from the organization, including regulatory information. And then the final tranche of data that we collected is around financing and how financing in the sector has been raised, whether it's through concessional finance or debt, and what the spread of that looks like. I'm going to hand this over to Daniel to talk about the unit economic costs.
Thanks, Jess. So one of the first things we did was look at the CapEx per connection across different markets. And over time, what we've seen is there's been a gradual reduction in costs. So between 2014 and 2018, the cost per connection fell between just over $1,500 to about $733. However, the interesting thing was if we split that analysis across new markets and across the different segments of developers, some being more established and others being new, we find that established developers were able to reduce the costs by 57% over the reporting period. And again, we're also seeing that experienced developers, on the other hand, are also 41% less expensive than new developers in those same markets, where those same markets are established. Now, if you look at the graph, especially the white chart, we are seeing that between 2018 and 2019, there was a slight increase in the connection, in the average connection cost. That's because of the mix between the number of developers. So in 2018, the established developers connected about 78% of sites. However, in the next year, only 40% of established developers connected new sites. So that blend of new and established developers is a key thing, a key insight we got. The other thing is the CapEx per connection in markets. While it varies, we are seeing that established markets like, as mentioned, Tanzania, Zambia, and Kenya have lower connection costs. And we're also seeing that on average, the connection costs in entering new markets is also falling by on average 33%. Next slide. Now, when you look at the operational costs, we bucketed these into three elements. We have obviously the central costs. We have the O&M costs as well as the fixed cost elements. Now, what is interesting is across the regions, being East Africa, West and Central Africa, there's a bit of standardization in the OPEX elements. However, we believe over time and through scale, we will possibly see more cost optimization as sites building becomes standardized. The other thing we're also seeing is on average, the OPEX per customer per month ranges between $2.5 to $6, which is the spread across these markets. The other thing around CapEx, we took a look at the cost structure, and we are seeing by and large the generation assets on average are more around 45 to 51%. And also that informs the incentives we've tried over time to create with donors and developers around RBF facilities, because we believe that will be the first entry point in lowering barriers for entry. We're also seeing, however, that distribution, there's a bit of spread within the distribution assets, and this variance is mainly attributed to different population densities and local geographical differences across these markets, where in some markets sites have dense customer bases, and in some markets less dense customer bases. I'll turn it over to you, Jess, for the funding.
Thanks, Daniel. So over the last 5 years, we've seen a pretty tremendous growth in the sector. In 2016, there were roughly 2,000 connections across the continent. Most of those were in East Africa. As of July of 2019, there were over 41,000 connections. And while the number has increased exponentially, there's quite a recognition that 41,000 connections is nowhere near where we need to be. What we see as you start to see the increase in the number of connections on the continent is that that's directly correlated with access to donor money. So there's a 12 to 18 month delay between the signing of concessional contracts, both for RBFs and other sorts of concessional money across the continent, and that triggers the increase in connections. So between 2016 and 2017, there was a growth rate of 161% across the continent. Between 2017 and 2018, there's a 267% increase in number of connections on the continent. And that concessional money is really instrumental, not only in ensuring the number of connections, but also in ensuring bringing in commercial capital alongside the concessional money to see this growth in the sector.
Now, when it comes to consumption, we are seeing the average revenue, or rather average consumption across markets is about 6.1 kilowatts per month. However, in some markets, it's much higher. For example, taking a look at Madagascar, Mauritania, and Nigeria, the consumption ranges between 9.5 to 30 kilowatts. That already shows that even in the high consumption markets, there's also a huge spread in consumption. Now, what we looked at, what this meant is obviously there's a need to incentivize and to increase demand and revenue growth that will effectively trigger revenue growth, which will make the sector viable. Next. We also looked at the reported ARPU numbers, ARPU being average revenue per user against utilization rate. However, we didn't find any close correlation between the two variables. This is because in most of these markets, there's a huge price variability in the kilowatt hour tariff prices. And this does not enable us to get correlation effects between those two variables. And on average, the ARPU numbers topple around, in some cases, like in Tanzania, $4.58, in markets like Nigeria, around 4.83, which is slightly below $5. And we can see that when you compare that with the operational expenses, we are seeing the ARPU numbers are typically just about breaking even point when in the context of OPEX costs. So we are seeing we are just beginning to get into this phase of scale, and there's a lot to be done with respect to demand growth.
Thanks, Daniel. So I'm going to just walk through some of the more interesting findings on the regulatory side. So as part of the organizational level data we collected information across the board on how long it takes developers to get to regulatory compliance. And within the structure of regulatory compliance, there's an array of different things, some of which can be done concurrently and some of which have to be done in order. And what we're seeing over the evolution of new sites is that we are seeing a reduction in the timeline to get through regulatory compliance. However, given that most of these markets, the way that regulatory compliance works is that for every single mini grid, you go through this process on a one-by-one basis. It means that the length of time in order to scale the sector is prohibitively long. So right now, the sector is looking at processing under 100 mini grids across the continent from a regulatory compliance perspective per year. If that were scaled to 1,000 approvals a year, that would still take us 140 years to get through to build the 140,000 mini grids that the World Bank estimates that the mini grid market needs. Again, over the last 5 years, we've seen a pretty radical reduction in the timeline that it takes to get through regulatory compliance. In 2015, we were looking at over 100 weeks just to get through 3 of the 6 regulatory steps. In 2019, we're down to just over 40 weeks. And we need to see this number continue to drop in order to see the scale that's actually needed to reach the demand on the continent. This next slide looks at country by country what the regulatory process is. And you can see there's quite a number of different aspects of getting through regulatory compliance. But there's also just a huge spread across the continent on what it takes in different markets to get through different aspects of compliance. And there's quite large variance between countries on what are the barriers to growth. So the village rights component and actually gaining access to the village and building out the site, building out the memorandum with the community has quite a big variable depending upon the country. Where we see the biggest barriers is in the generation distribution license and then in the environmental impact assessment. And there's a number of ways that AMDA and many other sector players are thinking about how to streamline this process, including building in portfolio applications for developers so that they're not going through this process every single time. But I just also want to highlight how important it is that we get this right, because if we can't figure out how to make the regulatory barriers commensurate with the size of the infrastructure, we are going to hit major roadblocks. Essentially, we're looking at, in many of these markets, the same amount of time to get through regulatory compliance for a 50 kilowatt site as it would take to build a multi-megawatt gas plant. And so the regulatory structures are not scaled in the way or operated in the way to meet the needs of these decentralized utilities.
When it comes to service quality, we are seeing on average private sector mini grids have a 97% uptime, which is way much better than the public grids in most countries. So having a look at, for example, Zambia, the public grid there, ZESCO, has an average uptime of about 72% based on 2017 public data. And we are seeing this service quality by uptime by mini grids is sufficient to enable rural development, being household consumption and business load growth. So which is a key thing. Next. The other thing we also looked at is the level of electrification within communities. Across East and Western Africa, we are seeing a range of between 40 and 50%, slightly above 50% in electrification rates within rural communities. While this is lower than the ideal of 100%, on average is also much better than the public grids. Now, again, also looking at Kenya Power, which is the public grid in Kenya, on average, the household electrification rate within rural communities is about 5%, while for businesses within those communities is about 22%. And you see in both those metrics, mini-grids score much higher and much better.
Thanks for that, Daniel. Before I walk us through the takeaways and then hand this back over to Aaron, I just want to highlight a couple of things. The data that we compared to ZESCO and Zambia for service level uptime, I just would like to say that that is the only public data that is available on service across the 12 countries that we're operating in. And so I'd just like to recognize how transparent Zambia is in providing information about their operational viability for the utility. It is actually really rare to find that with any government, and because there isn't as much transparency with the utility, in some of these cases it actually makes it quite difficult for us to be able to compare metrics between the utility and mini grids. So thank you to ZESCO and the Zambian government for making that data available. I think there's many big takeaways from this, and there's considerable more data that's actually in the report. So we encourage you all to read the report. We've tried to keep it chart heavy and word light, and that will be sent out to everyone on this call, as well as other stakeholders after this meeting. But I think that the three big takeaways that we would like everyone to walk away with are that public support works, that concessional finance that has been leveraged in the mini grid space over the last 5 years is what is allowing mini grids to scale, and it is allowing rural connections to be made and allowing access to power for hundreds of thousands of people. The second thing is that we need to figure out the regulatory structures in these countries. There's been tremendous effort over the last 5 years to streamline these processes, but it is still the greatest barrier for scale, and it is also the greatest barrier for investment. And so we need a concerted effort across all stakeholders to figure out how to make regulation structured in a way that is commensurate with the size and scope of mini grids. And the third thing that we really want to highlight is that there's still quite a lot of work to do on demand stimulation and load growth, and that we don't have the perfect example of a replicable model for demand stimulation, but it is something that we need to continue to work on as a sector in order to make these communities more economically viable. And with that, I think it's also really important that the funding and the support that go into load growth and demand stimulation are in conjunction with continuing support to build out sites. We want to make sure that we're looking at scale across the sector, both growing the load in the communities and growing access across the continent. And with that, I will turn it back over to Aaron. Thank you all for being here today.
Thanks, Jessica, and thank you, Daniel. That was a really good presentation. I think those takeaways are exactly what we want to discuss with our panelists. So with that, I would like to introduce our four panelists. Emmanuel Bujieka, who's a green mini-grids expert at the African Development Bank. Robert Wangoi from JUMEME, one of AMDA's founding members. Robert is head of sales at JUMEME and has been very active in our data working group and the creation of our approach for this report. Next, oh, I'm sorry, Ruchi, we have you. I'm jumping ahead of myself. I'm so sorry. You all will have to wait for the panelists. I'll continue that introduction after Ruchi. So Ruchi Soni of Sustainable Energy for All is going to present just the relationship between this, our report, and the state of the market report that Sustainable Energy for All just finalized. We used SE4All's benchmark or state of the market report data in our report, and they used AMDA's data in their report. So there's a lot of linkages between the two, but their report is fascinating in its own right. So Ruchi's just going to present a little bit about that, and then we will move into the panel. Apologies once again.
Thanks, Aaron, and I really didn't mind being skipped. Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here and hope everyone's doing well and staying safe during these difficult times. My name is Ruchi Soni, and I'm a program manager at Sustainable Energy for All. For those of you who may not know, SE4All or Sustainable Energy for All is an international organization looking to progress Sustainable Development Goal number 7, which is to provide greater access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. Before I kick off my presentation, I wanted to take this chance to congratulate AMDA on this pivotal piece of work in the sector, presenting pretty much what is the first of its kind for Sub-Saharan Africa. I think what also makes this research extremely timely is the fact that it's coming out at a time when the governments everywhere are trying to figure out how to stimulate their economies, their energy sectors in light of COVID-19. And the energy sector and the mini-grid space in particular will be this critical part of the recovery. To jump right into the presentation, I will briefly go over the highlights from the recently launched Minigrids Partnership Report. Very briefly, what is the Minigrids Partnership? The Minigrids Partnership, or the MGP, is a consortium of over 330 mini-grid stakeholders with the common goal of enhancing and complementing each other's work through greater collaboration and coordination. SE4All serves as the co-secretariat for the partnership, along with AMDA in its capacity as the chair. In July this year, as Aaron mentioned, the partnership published the State of the Global Mini-Grids Market Report. The goal of this report is really to raise awareness about mini-grids, mobilize investments in the sector, as well as serve as this benchmark to measure progress for sector decision makers. As I'll go through the key findings, you'll see that it dovetails rather nicely with AMDA's Benchmarking Africa Mini-Grids report as well. In terms of a quick introduction, how did this report come about? The genesis of this work really lied in a mini-grids partnership meeting almost 2 years ago, where the usual issues of policy, regulation, lack of replicable business models came up. But I think something that also came up consistently was the fact that there is this lack of market data and market intelligence in the sector, which unfortunately was unique to the sector. And I think something that this report, along with the AMDA report, intends to change. So this whole exercise was led by the Minigrids Partnership as this neutral coalition of the sector that commissioned this to BNEF, so the Bloomberg New Energy Finance, to draw together these dispersed informations into this unified and comprehensive view of the global market. I think what the AMDA report does here is very nicely complement this work to provide this much needed information around costs, performance, and scale information that really allows for better and more informed decision making. It also provides this base for comparing performance of companies across the different geographic regions. Switching gears to now sort of focusing on the highlights from the report, our analysis shows that over 111 million households can be served by mini-grids in sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, as well as island nations. We anticipate approximately 128 billion of US dollars of capital expenditure that's required for mini-grids to achieve or be part of the story of achieving universal access by 2030. A second point, which is really not surprising and was one of the findings from the report, was around that solar mini-grids are increasingly becoming the norm, with the share of lithium-ion increasing in the mix. So what this slide really shows is the cost of mini-grid technology, and specifically solar hybrid mini-grid systems, has become increasingly competitive. Significant and continued price reductions in technology have made rural electrification a more favorable option to public and private funders. We also think this is extremely critical for both governments and utilities to take a more comprehensive and a least cost-based approach that takes advantage of the breadth of technological options that are now available. A third finding from the report was really something that we also saw from the AMDA report, was around that generation accounts for the largest, being the largest component of the CapEx, followed by distribution. Within mini-grids, we saw that CapEx accounts for the highest project costs, and within CapEx, we saw generation being the largest component. This again is no surprise and is in large part due to the longer distribution lines, which are really meant for communities that live across a large geographical region. In addition, as anticipated, site development costs are also high due to increased accessibility costs. As I saw that the data from AMDA's report also demonstrates that CapEx can also be lowered by sector growth, and the CapEx was reduced from, I believe, 33% for new developers entering the market and 57% for existing developers. This again is very much in line with the MGP report findings. Another point, sort of pivoting to productive uses, what we saw was that adding productive use really lowers the LCOE by 39 to 50%. As you will see that both pieces of analysis really highlight the importance of productive use. Energy costs and revenue vary country by country and is really evident in the diesel price, distribution system, and installation costs. Designing business models to really focus on the electricity, on the use of electricity to improve both the cost, but also the ARPU by including large power consumers as mini-grid customers. Increasing ARPU, again, no surprise there, is in turn important for increasing a developer's economic returns and subsequently attracting more investment. Something that Jessica really sort of made a solid point around, and something we can corroborate through our report, was the fact that impact of public funding is really dramatic. So commercial financing is possible if there is public funding. We have witnessed an increased number of strategic financiers such as utilities, oil majors, trading houses that are participating increasingly in the sector since 2018. Most mini-grid developers have traditionally relied on public funding, such as grants for governments, DFIs, donor agencies, and foundations. Only some developers in the recent few years have been able to successfully raise commercial funding. So overall, we feel that the involvement of the public funders for financing remains extremely critical for encouraging the private financing as well. Another thing which was revealed through our analysis was the fact that we're now increasingly seeing large corporates enter the sector. So as you'll see on the diagram on the schematic on the slide, is that there's really a mix of both domestic and international players in the market, as most mini-grid developers are small-scale companies or startups. As the whole solar hybrid mini-grid market evolves, large and international corporates have also started to participate in the last few years. Some of this has been done by acquiring companies that offer, for instance, battery storage systems, UPS systems, and software control. Others have really sort of taken the whole partnership route with developers or invested in them. And larger corporates also have aimed to use these partners' technology and combine them with other services or sales network to offer new products in the sector. Another finding of the report, which really built on the data that was shared to us by the funders community, was the fact that only 13% of approved mini-grid financing has been dispersed. So taking a step back, the slide is important since this tracks the money committed in the sector. Since 2012, over $2 billion have been committed to the mini-grid sector, out of which only 13% has been dispersed. To add, which you don't see on the slide, is also the fact that 60% of those approved funding really was directed towards 10 countries. Again, seems very grim, and while the reality on the ground is likely to be better than the data suggests, it is still clear that there can be significant delays in receiving this funding and moving projects forward. Again, very much in line with what Daniel and Jessica already presented. There's also this lack of pure commercial funding, with the impression that the mini-grids market lacks scale. There is this unclear regulation landscape, and residential consumers have limited capacity to pay. Sort of switching gears to touch upon the regulatory aspect a bit. Again, no surprise, but most countries really lack main grid arrival rules. So we all understand that funding deployment may be quicker as the market matures. But this is really linked to the idea that the policy and the regulatory landscape of these countries where the recipient of these funding are located also needs to evolve. Governments need to take strong initiatives and promote robust regulatory frameworks that support the development of mini-grids. As it stands, and we're really using this as an example in the slide here, most countries lack main grid arrival rules, which is in fact one of the more important regulatory factors for mini-grid projects to scale. Globally, only 15 surveyed countries had clear rules for the main grid after mini-grid projects are in place. This is critical as this lack of regulation may lead to the mini-grid becoming a standard asset. Again, something that we wanted to unpack was talk about the concessional financing, but also look at the way the countries have approached this. So 8 nations, based on our research, have implemented tenders since 2019, with Nigeria having launched the largest results-based financing. So our research shows that concessional funding, such as upfront CapEx subsidies or results-based financing, can really be that lever to unlock both the private sector and impact investing. In Africa, these 8 countries have implemented tenders to install solar hybrid mini-grids since 2019. And I think one thing that came out repeatedly from our discussions from the private sector and investors was this increasing preference towards results-based financing due to the obvious reasons of it possibly improving returns, reducing risks of early stage debt or equity finance, and potentially unlocking big parts of this private capital. So these were just a sort of a summation of some of the insights and highlights from the research, and I encourage you to really dig into the content along with the AMDA report and share it widely with your network. This slide shows a snapshot of all the recommendations from the report, and some of which, again, I've already gone through. I think I can say this with confidence that we on this webinar want the mini-grid sector to be a thriving one. And I think making data more transparent and more easily available is a step in the right direction, and something that I think AMDA is clearly aspiring for and setting new benchmarks for. Finally, I just want to quickly acknowledge the critical support we received from the data gathering as well as analysis of the report through several donors and partners. Thank you again, and thanks Aaron and Jess for giving me the chance to present the report. Over to you. I'm going to hand it back to you.
Great, Ruchi. Thank you so much. I think the complementarities and the information within the State of the Market report are fascinating and extremely important for all of the stakeholders in the sector. So we really appreciate that you were able to make time, I think on your week of vacation, if I'm not mistaken. So we greatly appreciate that you're here. So now we can get back to the panelist introduction that I started earlier. We have Emmanuel Bujieka, the Green Mini-Grids expert at the African Development Bank. Robert Wangoi, who's the head of sales at JUMEME, one of AMDA's founding members and who's been active in the data working group. Dr. Sanusi Ohiara, who's the executive director of the Rural Electrification Funds in Nigeria and a board member of the Rural Electrification Agency there. And finally, Alex Graham, who is the business development manager at Infraco Africa based here in Kenya. So I really appreciate that we have these 4 different voices on this discussion panel. And I'd just like you to reflect on some of the points that we had in our sort of big takeaway messages. So some of the key findings were around the drop in costs that we've seen over the past couple of years. Another one was that operating costs and revenues are almost matching. So the profitability, as we all know, of mini-grids is difficult to find. And the third one was really around the political enabling environment and regulation. So I'm going to go through a couple of questions just on those 3 topics, because they're really the areas where AMDA's report indicates that we have some significant work to do, both in a positive and a challenging way. So I guess, Alex, as a private investor, I would love to hear a little bit about, well, as a concessional and private investor, I would love to hear a little bit about what these cost trends mean to you. We've seen the cost drop from 1,500 per connection to around 733. And I'd just like each of you to reflect on that and what it might mean for your work. And I'll start with Alex.
Sure, thank you. First of all, just wanted to congratulate you guys as well on this report, because it's excellent and something I think we've all been waiting for, particularly as investors. So, and I can't wait for the next one already. It's been a lot happening over the last year, so I'm really excited to see what it looks like in a year's time. I mean, yeah, the reduction in capex is exciting and it's crucial if we're going to be able to see these business models become viable and sustainable. You know, and I think this is even more important as we're starting to see even now a downward pressure on tariffs. So, you know, we need to be able to kind of continue to see these capex reductions that are kind of happening naturally and also through scale. And so I hope over this next year, with the additional scale that we're starting to see, that we'll start to see those capex reductions drop further.
Great, thanks, Alex. Robert, if you are there, we would love to hear from your perspective as a mini-grid developer. You know, what has it that's enabled these cost reductions over the past couple of years from your perspective? Is it learning? Is it the technology costs are dropping? What is your view on things?
Hi, Aaron. Thank you for the opportunity. And again, also I'd like to say congratulations on the report. It's been a while and finally we have it. I think I would say yes. The learning curves that we have had over the years are a big step towards cost reduction. Basically, you pick the do's and you drop the don'ts. I think that we might, or maybe I might touch on that when it comes to the productive use question, so that I can explain more on what we picked and what we did not pick. And then also on the technology, it's quite significant, as also the costs drop, especially with the panels. With the PV panels have been a huge start, and we are looking forward, of course, for things like storage to go down, because that is our biggest cost at the moment. So yes, I'll say it's about a mix of technology and learning curves of what to do, what we have been doing on the ground.
Great, thanks. I'll just ask one more follow-up question, Robert, because people are always curious, you know, is there more cost savings to be found, or do you think you've kind of reached the limit already?
There is still more cost savings to be found. I think I say this because it depends on, one, let me touch on the business model a company uses, the type of mini-grids you set up, type of customers, how you approach them, how you get involved with things like value chains in villages or in sites. I think there's a lot that has not been touched. And one of the biggest issues or things that I think we need to look at as mini-grid developers and operators is cultures of different areas, and understand that we cannot basically have a blueprint that serves every part of Africa or sub-Saharan Africa. So I think once we understand that, then we might be able to understand that there's a lot that we can invest in towards the community that basically will also help in the reduction of costs in running mini-grids.
Fantastic. Great answer. Thank you very much. Dr. Sanusi, I would pass it over to you as someone who's responsible for spending public money wisely. I'm keen to hear your perspective on these cost trends.
So, Aaron, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Sure, Dr. Sanusi. So the question was, given the cost reduction of about 60% over the last couple of years, we're keen to hear your perspective as someone who's responsible for public money and making sure it's spent wisely, how you're seeing these cost reductions. Are you seeing them as adequate, or do you really need to see more as someone running a rural electrification fund?
Well, first of all, let me start by really commending you guys, for the work and the effort that you've put into getting this report out. and also to say that basically we are in this business as government to ensure that the market reaches a stage where the forces of demand and supply can really allow prices to go down. And the reason why you've seen over the years that we've created so many programs around encouraging people and the enabling environment for people and developers to go into is because we want costs come down. The interest generated is really high. People are really incentivized to go into the business, and then also it is affordable for users, end users, to also patronize, because the excuse in the past had always been, solar technology is really expensive, we can't afford it, and that's why government even went in the first place. So for us, we are quite encouraged by the downward trend in price reduction, and we are hoping that we see more coming forward. Going forward. So we are quite encouraged by it.
Great, thank you so much, Sanusi. Yeah, I think one of the main indicators that we've seen is that these cost reductions quickly follow the investment trends, and we're still at a phase where many of our members only have 2 or 3 sites each. As Alex mentioned, she's excited to see next year's report already, because one of the important things that happened last year is many companies closed investment rounds, and so many of these companies will be scaling up over the course of 2020, and hopefully we'll be seeing cost reductions across the continent because of that. And once they're able to procure panels and batteries for not 3 but 30 sites or 300 sites in 5 years' time, those costs will drop automatically as well. So Emmanuel, as someone who is working with governments to design enormous programs that might need 300, 3,000, or 13,000 mini-grids, we're keen to hear your perspective as someone who's working directly with governments. What does this mean for you?
Yeah, thank you very much, Aaron. And then thank you very much for your team to putting this report together. And then I just wanted to say that this report corroborates what at the African Development Bank we have learned also from our own program, like the Green Mini-Grid Development Program at the CEFA, and then also the Mini-Grid Help Desk, and also with this the Mini-Grid Partnership, the report, the Global Mini-Grid State Market Report that Rishik represented. And then while designing the program, we are making sure that we are considering almost all the aspects in the program design. And then I just want to point out something. Since we are working with the government, and then the most key question we are receiving is that, why is it that the costs are going down, but the tariff is high? And then this is the issue. And then you see the cost going down, this is an opportunity for investor, but sometimes the perception and we need to frame the message so that the people of the government understand clearly what it means, because sometimes they expect the tariff to go down. And we knew that in most of the sub-Saharan African countries, we have a structural problem with the tariff calculation in the energy sector, because this tariff doesn't reflect the cost. And then once you say the tariff is costs are going down, but if it's cost reflective, starting from there, maybe you are going to see that maybe the tariff also are going down. And that is the problem. And at the African Development Bank, we make sure that while designing the program, we are going to have, like specifically in the energy environment, we are going to discuss maybe later, that at least we are going to make sure that there's a clear and transparent mechanism where the tariff for mini-grid are going to be set, so that people of the government are going to understand clearly the real cost. So, and then they are going to learn also, because there's also a matter of capacity building, they are going to learn also from the developer what the developers are facing. This is the key insight I can provide here. Yeah.
Emmanuel, that's a fantastic answer. And I'm going to bring it right back to Robert as we shift over to the productive use question, because Emmanuel, your comment about the kilowatt hour cost goes directly into the productive use conversation, I think, because one of the main reasons why the kilowatt hour cost is high is because demand is low. And so there's this contradiction where actually what we want is higher demand, but because there's such low consumption, each unit of consumption is very, very costly for the developer. And we have this problem as you described. So Robert, I would love to hear from you as JUMEME. I think many people know that JUMEME has been one of the market leaders on productive uses and finding ways to increase demand. So I would love to hear you comment on the issue of operating costs versus consumption, and a little bit maybe about what JUMEME has been doing to improve that situation.
Thank you, Aaron. I think, like you mentioned, a lot of this data was taken when most of us had 2 to 3 grids. And it was quite clear that, yes, operation costs were quite high as compared to the revenues that we were getting. So just to mention what we were doing as what we do in our business model as JUMEME, where we have productive users as a key component for us, is we basically, like I said, we understood the do's, and we also try to understand the don'ts. And one of the biggest, I think, winners, let me call them winners and losers, was we were able to do a pilot that was long enough for us to understand that the community, for example, we were working with here, was not really keen on taking up new businesses with regards to technology, but rather was quite keen on basically improving what they already had. So we brought in a few new ideas, and we set up also for tests, and we also found some basically some new entrepreneurs to run these new businesses. And we also set up, or rather improved what existed before, like meals, and in another case, we are looking at battery charging for fishermen. And what we picked or understood is that what we found in the villages basically is the one that still exists, so the businesses continue running. And what we brought in as new, most of it failed. So what we understood is to come in, put in a few, instead of too much effort, put in a few effort and improve what is already there, mechanize it, not mechanize it, sorry, electrify it, and bring in a machine where they were using diesel, now they use electricity. So basically, that was one of our biggest winners, where we understood that they already know and they already work. So we just enabled them use electricity. And we also looked at different aspects of productive users. If you see what kind of mini grids we run, is that our productive use, we are looking at machinery like milling machines and huge battery chargers, as compared to phone charging, which comes to a lower category in our case of commercial use. So understanding that that villages also, they are not quite behind in terms of technology and in terms of using big machines. It's just that if you can find a way of having a mini grid that can enable that, then that works better for a developer than pushing too much on productive use of small gadgets and basically technology. So for us, we understood that bigger productive users helps us. So we went a step further and put our foot into some of the value chains that are found in these villages, and put our foot into also some resources that had never been basically been used before completely. And we came up with a model that we call a keymaker model. And what basically this does is we look at the energy, we create a nexus between the energy and something that is a resource that is quite huge in a village or in a site, for example, fishing. And come into this value chain where it's not connected. We connect the dots, markets, transport, and additional, basically we look at additional fish that, for example, fish that was not being sold before to markets. We find a market for that. So in short, what I'm saying is that we found that for us to mitigate this issue of high costs to operational costs to revenues, we need to tie our mini grids into nexuses of different resources in sites. And also that is not enough. We also have to go into the value chain of these resources, and you have to connect the dots that are not already connected in these villages. And most of these dots, basically, the connection is enabled by the availability of electricity and also the availability of expertise that comes with our managers on the ground that was not there before. So we basically go an extra step of not only connecting productive users, but also looking deep into how their value chains look like, and where there is a lack, we look or we seek to connect and basically be part of this value chain. So we also understand the ups and downs that they face in the markets and in a value chain. So that way, when there is a pain, we understand the pain. When there is a gain, we understand the gain, or we reap the gain also. I don't know if that is good enough.
Yeah, Robert, that was very comprehensive, and I think was really valuable. I think one thing I would like to put to our next panelists is, Robert just described how, JUMEME has become much more than an energy company. So they're not really just selling electrons. They're working on community development. In the case of JUMEME, they're working with ice and fish and transport and market linkages, etc. And this is a complicated operating environment, and it cannot be made available for every village everywhere. Some villages don't have those opportunities. So, Dr. Sanusi, I'm curious to hear your perspective on the productive use element that Robert just described. Is it something that the Nigerian government is keen to focus on, promoting productive uses? And I guess, of course, I'm sure the answer is yes. But the question is, do you really see it as the responsibility of these companies to really do both sides, both the demand work and the sort of energy production, or do you think that they should be just energy companies?
Okay, for us, as you know, our story has been the one of just trying different things to see what works. We started off with pilots that just basically focused on building mini grids as a way of promoting the technology, and then we realized issues around prices and then productive use. And then we now started making sure we developed programs that had some sort of elements of productive use, for you as a criteria for you to qualify as a developer to take part in. And we realized that that wasn't enough. They still had issues with, payments of the tariff, and really getting, the requisite, demand for them to, make business sense. So we moved from there to a program we did with GIZ called Minigrid Acceleration Scheme. And we had this component called the Keymaker model. And the Keymaker model basically tried to encourage the developers, to focus on, productive activities, and not just invest in the power systems, but also invest in some sort of business or productive activity within their sites. So we moved from there, just trying not to put all of the burden on the developer, to also developing a new program under the NEP, Nigerian Electrification Program of REA, which is funded by AfDB, specifically for productive use. So it's a component just specifically for productive use, where we have already existing mini grids that are having problems, with productive activities within their sites, to bid, and then we see how we can provide some sort of grants for them for equipment financing and productive activities, basically to support the necessary demand, for their services, so that they can make more money. So it's been a gradual progression for us, because as government, we recognize that these issues would always come up, but we have always been proactive to put measures and programs in place to mitigate the challenge. So this is where we are for us. So I feel it's very important what developers of mini-grids are doing. So we need to really support them in any way that we can.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sanusi. So, Emmanuel, I'm going to jump to you because I want to know, as you mentioned in your last comment, you really take all of the different variables into account when you're building a tariff model. But one thing that is often left out of the LCOE, the least cost of electricity, is community engagement. It is customer service. It is engaging on productive uses. That is not traditionally in your engineering handbook of how to price electricity. So I'm curious at the AfDB, how can we build this in there? How can we get governments to understand that, part of the problem with the high price is the very strict engineering perspective. And actually we need a more humanistic perspective when we're looking at these programs. Maybe you could comment on how you're engaging with the governments on these issues.
Yeah, thank you very much, Aaron. And this is, for me, this is the key for the key area to develop for the success or even yes, to keep the mini-grid industry going forward. I will explain you why. Listen, the perception of let's say the mini-grid is most targeting the rural community. And this rural community, they don't have like a strong economic activity, which are going to consume a lot of electricity. And then at AGBA, we have noticed that with internal thinking that we must include the productive use during the planning section. What does it mean? It means that at the feasibility or feasibility study, this is where we need to conduct for each village, if I can say like that, or each community, let's say the codex cutting for productive use, and then identify all this type of opportunity. And even put like how much does this implemented accessibility cost, and then have let's say have an idea of the investment cost to push the productive use. This is very important because in this community, and then we have a lot of cases like that, at a certain point to reduce like the perception of let's say the end user, that they are going to pay more for electricity than people in the urban area. And this thing can get involved, let's say the politician or even the MP to get involved, to step in and then starting threatening the company. We need to make sure that at the planification, we include all these aspects in the table, And then we need to put also some financial instrument to support the productive use. And for me, today, what we are designing currently in the program at AfDB, we are going to include also, let's say, the healthcare, electrification of the healthcare. Within the community, we are going to also identify all these things, put it at productive use, and then identify all of them, and see how much will this thing cost to electrify all these type of businesses. However, we cannot do it alone. I heard that the developers said, JUMEME, they were doing it themselves, that key maker models, they are going the same developer, but it's a place now to call for, let's say, global cooperation with others, GFI, who has program on the, let's say, entrepreneurship for women, or even local and social development, so that we get involved those people around this type of ideas, and then push together to make sure that at least once electricity reach the village or the community, at least those communities can just leverage on this electricity to strengthen or develop the productive use, which are going to generate also income for them. Yeah.
Thanks, Emmanuel. That was a great answer. Then we'll be looking to collaborate with the AfDB as AMDA to develop those approaches that can be linked up together. I think that would be fantastic. Yeah, great. So, Alex, you are an investor looking at the profitability of these companies, and as we discussed, there's very thin margins. I'm curious how Infraco is encouraging its investees or is looking at potential investees based on their non-energy activities, on these community engagement activities. So, do you specifically look for that, or are you looking for just a fantastic engineering company that can deploy quickly? Maybe tell us a little bit about what you're looking for.
Sure. I mean, I think the short answer is yes. Because we do see that growing productive use within the mini grid is essential to making this business model work. The challenge is, though, as an investor, and we are an infrastructure investor, and I think this is probably a challenge a lot of infrastructure investors will face, is that yes, we want it, but also we have to try and now understand that business model as well, and how that fits into the whole business. And so I think yes, we want to be investing in developers that are looking to grow productive uses. Does it have to be done by them, or could it be through partnerships? Or I think those are different areas that can be explored. And I think the difficulty again why reports like yours are great is because we have very little data about what the actual value add is of these productive uses, and how to build an investment case around that and present it to our investment committees is really challenging right now. I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I'm muted. Yeah, that's exactly one of the major challenges that we are facing. And I think that you hit the nail on the head there. So thank you very much. We have one more question, but we're already over time. So I want to give each panelist just kind of 30 seconds to talk about the importance of the enabling environment, the political enabling environment. And Dr. Sanusi, I'm going to start with you. Nigeria is well known as one of the leaders on in the mini grid sector, but as Jessica presented in the report, I've heard you say many times, Sanusi, that Nigeria expects the need for around 10,000 mini grids, maybe more. We now have 10 years left. So just the approvals processes for 1,000 mini grids a year is kind of a mind-blowing sort of job. And one of the things that we found in our report is that in Nigeria, you guys are doing great compared to other countries, but just that number is staggering. So do you see digitization of approvals, or like bundling together of approvals in the future of Nigeria, or how do you think that we can approach this? And because AMDA, of course, has this as a key area that we want to collaborate on. So we would love to hear your thoughts as one of the people dealing with this problem from the government side.
For us, it's been a learning, it's been a learning process. So we started off just doing 1, 2, and a few mini grids, but like you rightly pointed out, we're going to be scaling up, very quickly soon. And in preparation for that, what we've done is, this is not something government can do alone on its own. We've gotten a lot of, support, no doubt, from DFIs and international development agencies. One of those supports is to the regulator, which is now helping them to try and digitize, this process. And that's been ongoing for, I think, 2 years now. And I think they are done. GIZ is the one providing that support to the regulator, just in preparation for, being more efficient in issuing these permits, and, rolling it out, as quickly as possible. And to also support the regulator from our side in REA, we also have like a DEX office there, where we have 1 or 2 of our staff to also help process things, quicker as they get there. So if the developers, come to us and they need our help, we just point them to our staff there. Also a digitized platform where they can quickly do this, and we have people follow up. So this is just our way of managing the situation, but there's always room for improvement. So going forward, we hope to see how we can better the process and make it more efficient.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sanusi. Alex, in the State of the Market report that Ruchi presented, one of the questions that the team doing that report asked was about major barriers to investment, and regulation and the enabling environment was the #1 barrier to investment. I'm curious what Infraco thinks about that, and why is it so important from your perspective?
Sure. I think we agree. We do see it as a huge risk for investors. you know, the pace, the lack of clarity around process, the kind of stability of the regulation as well. You know, for an investor, how can we make an investment decision today based on a policy, sorry, a regulatory framework that could change 2-3 years down the line? No, we do see it as a big risk and something that definitely needs to be fixed and improved and standardized. I mean, we see big differences across a lot of different countries as well. And so that also presents its own challenges.
Fantastic. Thanks, Alex. Robert, I'm going to jump to you. So we saw that in some countries, including in Tanzania, where JUMEME is operating, just the environmental impact assessment alone can take a year or so. Did you ever see your staff at JUMEME sort of waiting around with not much to do because of these government delays? Has that been a problem? Because at AMDA, we see all this time waiting and we think, oh, well, doesn't waiting cost money? And isn't the cost the major complaint of the governments? So I'm kind of curious, you know, are you seeing that same trend? If we could speed up these processes, wouldn't it also drop the costs like the governments are and everyone wants to see?
Definitely, yes. From experience, we have seen a delay of development of some of our mini grids because of the environmental impact assessment. It used to take years, a couple of months, let me say many months. Although I don't know whether I will call it an improvement. There has been a directive by the president at some point where he has said, you go ahead and develop, and then the certificate will follow you later, or rather will be basically given after. But this has come after we have suffered a lot, probably from the year 2014 to the year 2019. There were so many delays because of that certificate. So I don't know whether this directive will keep going or whether it will change again with governments or the person who comes and is at the top. So I do agree with the other panelists that there needs to be a regulation that makes this faster. Because one of the challenges of working with someone's word is they are not there forever. At some point, they will get out anyway. So we need it in gazetted. We need it as a policy, and we need it followed also or implemented, and not only written.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Robert. Sorry if I'm cutting you, but we're running over time. That was a fantastic answer. Emmanuel, it seems like the AfDB as a technical assistance provider has some clear avenues or clear marching orders, I should say, from the people on this panel. Are you working at the AfDB to speed up this regulatory process?
Yeah, look, we noticed ourselves that within some of our program, yes, there's some bottleneck on how to speed up this the implementation, the execution of this regulatory or enabling environment activities. And then the management of AfDB, they internally take action to increase and then to speed up the process. And then I think that in the coming months and years, we are going to accelerate the execution, because the problem was mainly on the side of execution. However, we need to also be patient, because people at the government, the enabling environment is very critical, because people at the government at the same time, they are implementing it, they are learning. So it's implementation and learning. And then this is very important specifically because we need to make sure that the result of the enabling environment, all the procedure, the law, or the decree we are going to implement, take all the recommendation for let's say that the new generation, all the recommendation needed to have the new generation mini-grid implemented. Specifically, if you look at the report of the global state of mini-grid report, the recommendation, specifically, yeah. And then, at the bank, we had like a tool, technical assistance, where our activity, our intervention is more programmatic. So we wait so that the government should express the need to have these enabling environment implement, and then we just they need to send a formal request to the AfDB, and the AfDB will analyze And then we are going to assist them to implementing this report. And in the other side, we also have the mini-grid help desk, where if, for instance, let's say in Nigeria, Dr. Unusi, that is Sanusi, they have some thinking of what maybe they want to conduct a study to understand specific things about the regulation. They can quickly, and then this is very emergency request, they can quickly liaise with the legal help desk to help them, assist them in executing these emergency or as they want to have. Yeah. I think that we have the tools now, and then other stakeholders and other partners have tools, but we have the tools at the bank, African Development Bank, which can really help all the stakeholders to accelerate the execution of the mini-grid in our continent. Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah, Emmanuel, that was a really helpful answer, and we hope that the digitization and speeding up can be something that is worked on across the continent very, very soon, that we're seeing in Nigeria already. Okay, I think we have spoken enough. At the moment, we're keen to hear from you, and the Power4All team has been collecting questions for the panelists to answer over the past hour or so. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Rebecca Shirley, who's the Director of Research at Power4All, to moderate the Q&A. And just so you're aware, we realize that the session is ending in about 10 minutes. We will close we will wrap up the webinar at 5:30 East Africa time for panelists that need to leave. But then we will continue for another 10 minutes. If people have extra time, we're going to run over just because we're all mini-grid nerds and we love talking about this stuff. So I'm going to hand it over to Rebecca. And just, Rebecca, maybe like 2 minutes before half an hour, just pass it back so we can say our thank yous, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the riveting discussion so far. It's been really fantastic. Aaron, I'm going to start with a few quick questions that I'm seeing from the Q&A that are just about more about the report for you and Jess. The first one is, let's just start with what this all means from here moving forward. So do you as AMDA or any of the panelists have thoughts on what all of this data tells us about projections for development costs, operations costs, and volumes in the next, say, 3 to 5 years?
So I can give a quick answer, and Jess, you can follow up. So what we're seeing right now is, in terms of projections, we're not making any. This is a data and evidence report. We hope that people can use this evidence that we're creating to make those projections. But what we heard Daniel describe in the presentation is that we are seeing existing developers in their home markets continuing to drop costs radically. Some of the most mature companies are under $500 per connection, under $450 per connection. Some are even at $300 per connection in some cases. So these are extremes, but these are all companies that are doing 15, 20 grids as well. So what happens when they're doing 1,500, right? We think that the projections are all quite optimistic. And to answer the other question, where do we go from here? This is going to be an annual report. We're preparing already to not only collect data on the metrics that we have presented to you today, but to collect much more, because as Emmanuel mentioned, what are the governments doing with regulations? They are learning. And we have been learning as well, and our developers have had to build the trust and the learning of how to work with us on this. And now that we have that established, we will be doing much more in the future. Jess, do you want to say anything quickly on that?
No, that's okay. I think you covered it pretty broadly.
Well, Jess, the next question is for you anyway. There was lots of questions in the Q&A about the insights that you guys brought to the table around regulation and the regulatory timelines. So one question is whether or not you're seeing an actual correlation between the time for licensing and project size. And a follow-up question to that is whether or not there are any examples you've seen of portfolio aggregation, i.e. approvals that are applied across an entire portfolio.
Yeah, those are both really good questions. So the first question on on whether or not system size is impacted by the timeline. The answer is not really. So I'll try and keep this brief, but particularly in East Africa, what the regulatory structure created was caveats for under 100 kilowatts, or generally under a megawatt. But the exemption process is often almost exactly the same as a regular licensing process. And so there isn't really a disaggregation on size that we're seeing. And in fact, what we see in Tanzania and in Kenya is that often the regulatory process takes as long, whether or not you're developing, a 100 megawatt system or a 50 kilowatt one. And so size doesn't seem to be an impact on the regulatory timeline at all. And the second question was whether or not we're seeing portfolio applications. This is kind of a complicated question. So there's sort of two, in a very broad way, this is very broad and generic, but there's sort of two groups of the way that regulations are working. One is what I call the Wild West, Aaron calls the free market, is where developers can come and pick the sites that they want, and they're applying to the regulatory body for each and every one of those individual sites. And that system is much quicker as far as getting an individual site through and getting to build. But what we're seeing in a different set of countries is concessional models, where the government is putting together the concessional package, and that concessional package includes the regulatory approvals for those sites. And so in the cases where there's concession, there is a portfolio application because it's all part of the same package. What we're not seeing is in that free market space where you can sort of come and build where you think that they're the best sites, there isn't a process in most of those markets to truly create a portfolio application. Often in markets that do have portfolio applications like Uganda, you're still providing very detailed information on every single site. So it's not really reducing the amount of work that goes into putting it together. It's just that it goes in as a single package.
Got it. Makes sense. Okay, let's move into some questions around finance. A lot of questions were coming through around the different types of financing mechanisms that are available and that are being used. One question was, why such a low proportion of committed funds? I think this also came from Ruchi's presentation from SE4All. So Ruchi, feel free to jump in here. But why we're seeing such a low percentage of committed funds actually being dispersed? Is this just because of project lead times, or are there other elements that contribute into that hold up for finance that's actually already committed?
I can take this one, Aaron.
Sure.
Ruchi, if you want to jump in. I think that actually Ruchi should jump in because I don't think we have a fully robust answer to that question. We know that funds are being committed. I think that different things are happening in different countries. So some of it is the structure, some of it, particularly in the concessional model that I was just talking about, is the committed funds, but it takes 2 to 3 years to get the concession package ready. And so we're not seeing them deployed in those markets. Some of it is reasons that are so far beyond my comprehension, I don't know the answer to. And then some of it is just where they're at in the process. So like in the case of Nigeria, there's 300 million that's committed in Nigeria, and they're starting to deploy those sites, and that money is starting to be deployed. But there are some structural there's some delays in the ability for developers to close finance, which is limiting how quickly that money is getting deployed. So it's a little bit different in each market.
Great. I actually have a follow-up question about the co-financing, but Ruchi, do you want to jump in and say anything on the SE4All report's findings? Okay.
Did we lose Ruchi?
So we might have lost her. So let's move on in the interest of time. So related to that last comment you just made, Jess, there was another question around the results-based financing angle here. And given that the results-based financing system tends to put the onus of raising that capital, that initial capital, I should say, on the mini-grid companies themselves, do you feel like this ends up creating a barrier to entry for local mini-grid players that might not have equal access to, say, the international development financing space?
I mean, it's a really good question, and I don't know that we have any data to support anything one way or the other. I would say that anecdotally, there are very few truly results-based financing facilities that have come forward. So I think the one in Nigeria is truly results-based. The Universal Electrification the Universal Electrification Fund, which AMDA is working with PowerforAll, will be truly results-based. But the majority of the results-based funds actually provide some upfront capital and some capital partway through the process. And whether or not that ability to, the lack of upfront capital is impacting investment, I think probably varies from investor to investor. So I might just pass this to Alex to see how they feel about it.
Yes, Alex, do you have a response here? And maybe also Dr. Sanusi from RIA, if you want to talk about the experience in Nigeria, that could also be helpful.
Sure, I mean, I can go first.
Okay, go ahead, go.
No, I mean, it's I guess a short answer, because I think the question was around whether it's a barrier to like smaller and local kind of developers.
Yes.
And I'm not sure it is, because I think there are other complications and factors that play into that. I think actually if developers of all different varieties are able to access the results-based financing, then it just provides more certainty and comfort to investors. And so I think, you know, it's really important, and the different structures present different challenges, but I think that it just essentially needs to be there. So I'm not sure it does. Yeah, hopefully that kind of answers your question.
Okay, so from our side, you know, this was, you know, initially when we started this program, the Nigerian Electrification Program, there were fears around crowding out, you know, local developers for the same reason, the performance-based grant, you know, that we give. But what you notice is, so far, most of, you know, the developers that have keyed in and have, you know, been shortlisted, that we signed, you know, agreements with, you know, local developers. And this is because it doesn't really limit you to just doing 1, 2, 3 projects. If you have the capacity to do 1 or 2, I mean, you come in and sign for 1 and 2, provided you go through our criteria and you are shortlisted. You also have capacity to do 5, 10, 20, 50, 100 sites. I mean, there's nothing really stopping you if you meet our criteria. So I think it's a fair space, especially given our own experience, for, you know, players from, you know, local and, you know, international arena to, you know, participate. So we haven't really had that challenge in Nigeria.
Okay, well, that's actually very good to know, and good to hear that it's not presenting a challenge to the local companies. Aaron, as per your instructions, it's 5:28, so I'm passing back to you to just say thank yous, and I'm happy to stay on. We have a ton of questions from the participants to keep asking.
Great. I have to say a very, very heartfelt thank you to all of our participants and our panelists in particular. We had a huge turnout that we were kind of overwhelmed by. So this is all for you. Right now, we are sort of starting the process of working with this report. In a way, we are not finishing. We have a lot of work to do together as a community, and we are terrifically grateful that we've been funded to do this important work by the Omidyar Foundation, the Dune Foundation, and most significantly by the Shell Foundation. We're very much looking to scale up our operations. So we are in a fundraising phase at the moment, and we are very keen to be looking towards ways to scale up AMDA and our activities over the coming months. So if you like the report and are a donor or a funder, as we've seen, the sector is not profitable at the moment, so our membership fees are very, very small, and we are reliant on donor funding. So I thank you again for your participation, and Rebecca, I will hand it back over to you. For any of the panelists that have to leave, you're forgiven. It's our fault for talking too much. That's generally what I do, so I apologize personally for that one. But I pass it back over to Rebecca for some more Q&A. Thanks.
Great. So let me ask a couple of questions now around costs, since there was a lot of questions in the chat about that. And Daniel showed us that great slide about the relationship between the low average revenues per user and the high OpEx. And actually, Aaron, you just kind of hinted at this with your closing remarks as well. So how do we reconcile the low ARPU and the high OpEx? Can we put those numbers in context? Does this mean that the mini grid is actually not yet profitable? And what do you think that this means for the sector more broadly?
We could probably all answer that. Daniel, you have not jumped in yet. I saw you.
Yeah, so basically, I think one thing we need to put into perspective is maybe as JUMEME mentioned, it's the mini-grid model is essentially a learning model, and a bulk of the responses, 55% of those companies have 3 sites and under, and most of these sites were built in the last 2 years. So you are looking at opportunities to optimize costs, especially on the OpEx side, and also you're looking at opportunities to ramp up ARPU as we get understanding of what works with respect to demand stimulation. So I would say it's not over yet, and I would say this is is by and large part of growing pains. I'll just leave it at that.
Great. Does anyone else want to take a stab at that? Maybe JUMEME?
Yeah, hi, Rebecca. Yeah, I think Daniel has basically mentioned it. It's a learning curve, and I think the more we scale up, the more we can have a clear answer on that. I mean, we are looking at just a quick example at having at least 50 mini-grids to start speaking of a good scale up for us. So once we get there, then it might now make sense to start now comparing the ARPUs and the costs we are also incurring. And it needs a bit of time also to get there. So at the moment, we might say it's a bit immature, but it's definitely a pipeline that we need to have an eye on and start basically looking at the moment, and start looking at mitigations and how to basically tip the balance where you have a bigger ARPU as compared to your costs.
Yes, the sector has to continue down the pipeline.
I would, Rebecca, I know we've already.
Aaron.
I would just take 30 seconds to note that this is one of the overarching focuses of the sector's efforts. But we need to remember that even the oldest mini-grid company extremely young. And if you look at Amazon, if you look at Tesla, 2 of the sexiest, biggest companies in the world, Tesla is not profitable today. It took Amazon 15 years to reach profitability. And now they're changing the way the world works. And mini-grids, it is undoubted that they will change the face of Africa. But if we ask them to be profitable in a month's time or in a year's time, we're not going to see the growth of the sector. What we need to see is investment in those things that Robert and Daniel were talking about, and not just investment in an electricity project, because these are not just electricity projects. So I would leave it at that.
Very inspiring, Aaron. Great. So another question, actually, just speaking of the learning curves that Daniel mentioned earlier, and the limited exposure that most of the companies have thus far with 3 grids or less. One participant is asking whether or not demand stimulation efforts are best served by mini-grid companies themselves, or whether other players need to come in that might have more experience. And if so, what models should they be testing, and who is best placed to do that work?
Thanks, Rebecca. Those are great questions. I can tell Aaron also wants to jump in on this one. I think that if you talk to the developers and AMDA represents, there's an array of answers to that question. Some of them do want to be doing the entire spectrum, and some of them don't. And I think it is up to the individual developer to figure that out. Because the sector is still in its infancy, there hasn't been the diversification of roles that happens as sectors mature. So we haven't seen players step into that. I think for the long-term viability of the sector, there will need to be companies that come in and specialize in demand stimulation. As far as I know, there aren't really companies that are stepping into that role. There are different NGOs that are exploring different options, and many of our members and the companies that we work with are also working with those firms. But to date, I don't think there's a leader in the market, and they're certainly more in the experimental phase than in the this works and let's scale it phase.
Great. And Aaron, do you wanna have an answer as well?
I'll just say that that question is exactly the questions that AMDA has.
Yes.
You will see those questions in our report. You know, there's two different models. There's the mini grid companies should do everything model, and then there's the we should have expertise coming in from different angles, different sectors model. And there isn't a great answer at the moment. But the only way the sector will grow and will gain radical amounts of investment that we need to see is for us to figure that out. So we're actually calling for work on those exact questions with our report.
Yeah, I liked this question a lot. It reminded me of exactly what we're doing in Uganda with Utilities 2.0 and trying to test this very question. So more on that soon. Let me ask, of course, a question that is very timely, given the situation that we're in right now. A couple of participants want to understand the impact of COVID and how COVID has affected mini-grid businesses. Are most of these still in business? Has this affected ability to access finance? Is this affecting consumption, etc.? So what's the impact of the current situation that we're all facing?
I'll take that again, just because I've been the team member working on this mostly. So the answer is it depends on where the companies are. Africa is enormous, and different rules and different levels of fear and political involvement in the crisis mean that it's being handled differently everywhere. We have been working with Odyssey Energy Solutions and the Cross Boundary Innovation Lab to look at real-time live data about the demand in East Africa and in Nigeria in particular. And one curious finding that we have found is that the demand has not reduced very much in Eastern Africa, but in Nigeria, it is down about 28% since the beginning of COVID. So there's some seasonality issues in there that we cannot say is only related to COVID. But two of the big understandings of why this has happened is that the lockdown in Nigeria was much more strict than it was in Eastern Africa. In Tanzania, for instance, there was no lockdown. And in the other thing is that while we've seen a lot of job losses across the continent because of these lockdowns, in Eastern Africa, what we saw was a lot of people actually lost jobs and moved back into their rural communities while they're waiting for the economy to recover. And so there's actually additional members in the households in East Africa, and they've come from urban environments where they may have brought a TV or a laptop into the rural communities. And so we're actually seeing increases or stabilization of demand in those rural areas. This is not, however, an indication of health, because that means that there are unemployed people whose mouths need to be fed in those communities, and we're expecting to see a drop-off in the future. And in Nigeria, the lockdown being so severe that we just saw businesses close, and so demand dropped immediately.
Right, so a bit of a more people in the household, but also less disposable income, and not sure exactly where that leaves us. Danielle or Jess or Emanuela, anyone else that's on the call, Emmanuel, sorry, anyone else that's on the call of our panelists want to take a stab at the COVID question?
Well, I would say for most of the companies, the COVID impact would not be, you know, if there were to be a long-term impact, there wouldn't be based on demand, but rather, you know, the ability to raise that growth capital that, you know, would sustain the scaling curve. So that's the question that we are trying to answer over the next couple of months. And also the other thing is the fact that with governments, with movement restrictions, a lot of the regulatory process might end up being stagnated due to the fact that there's less digitization in that front. So so those are some of the things we are looking at with respect actually to the growth aspect rather than demand.
Yeah, that's what we've seen as well. Great. Alex, looks like were you about to take a stab at that as well? No?
No, I was just gonna, I guess, add to what everybody else has been saying. I mean, we have seen, we're investing in Sierra Leone with PowerGen to develop a pipeline of projects there, and certainly the restrictions on movements initially slowed things down, but we're starting to see things pick up again. And we're, talking to other developers, we are seeing the impact in terms of the kind of pace of deployment. I think it's too early to see what the impact is on the actual consumption, certainly from what we've seen so far. And then just in terms of the investor community, yeah, I think certainly we are, as Infraco, continuing to look to invest in the sector, and we are seeing other investors continuing to look for projects, but there definitely seems to have been a slowdown as well.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, it's now exactly 5:40, 10 after we were supposed to finish. And I think we've actually gotten through most of the questions. There's just a few follow-up and more clarification type questions. So AMDA, I think that you can answer those as you see fit and respond to your participants. But Aaron, I'm going to hand it back over to you now to officially close the session.
Thanks, Rebecca. And thanks everyone for staying late. I still see we have 133 participants on the call, so there's more interest than we had expected. So this is fantastic. I've already said my thank yous, but I'll say them again. This was fascinating from my perspective. I loved hearing the panelists discuss these complicated issues with us. And I particularly want to thank my team. AMDA is a group effort, and I want to thank specifically Jessica, because this has been her passion. It's been in her waking hours and in her sleeping hours on her mind for the past 2 years. And we greatly appreciate all the work that you in particular have done on all of this, Jess. And we're looking forward to starting another round of data collection to put all of this, what we've just discussed, in context for next year. So while we work together with governments, donors, mini-grid companies, etc., on how to use this information, we're keen to work together with all of you as sector stakeholders as well. And we're keen to have your comments on the report and to hear what you would like to see in the future. So please reach out to us at the communications email that is attached to the reminders that you've seen. After this is finished, we will be sending out an email, or PowerforAll will be sending out an email to all participants that has a link to not only the report, but also to a podcast that PowerforAll and I did about the findings earlier this week. And there's the communications email address there for you to address any comments or suggestions. And once again, we look forward to engaging with all of you as we move forward. Thanks all for your participation and for staying a bit late.
Thanks, everyone. And I just very, very briefly just want to thank one more time the ECA, the Economic Consulting Associates, who provided all of the analytics for this and was instrumental in making this happen, and to all the developers who provided data. It is greatly appreciated, and we're forever indebted to you for your work.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.